Hello, can folks hear me?
Yep.
All right, we'll start in a minute or so.
Hi folks, good morning.
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 So we'll get started in just a minute here. They should add a little feature to Zoom that shows you when the rate of participants joining has decreased to a certain point, and then that's the time to kick off the meeting. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. For those that don't know me, I'm Ben. On the TOC, Ben Hyman, helping to chair the storage working group. So we've had a couple of sessions now. I think they've been great sessions. We've talked about some good stuff. Clint and Steve gave a great presentation to the TOC a couple of weeks back about some of the conversations. And we've also had some mailing list threads where there's been questions raised about, what's the fundamental charter of the storage working group? What should we consider in our purview? What should we take on? What artifacts, if any, should we try to create? And so I kind of wanted to devote, rather than pull in another person to come speak in today's session, there's lots of folks that want to continue to talk about their projects. Instead, I really wanted to devote today's session to really just discussing what we want the charter of the working group to be, what we want the output to be. I think we've all got a couple of good ideas, but I wanted to start with that. And assuming that we don't decide that that we don't want to work on what has been discussed, which is a cloud-native storage landscape type of document, then I'd like to transition after we get more clarification on what we do want to work in. I'd like to transition to actually talking about that and figuring out how we'd like to put that together. Again, that second topic is assuming that the group is in support of doing that. If the group is not in support of doing that, then we'll scratch that. Does that make sense?
Yep, makes sense to me.
Yep.
Okay. So why don't I take a quick stab at the idea behind the storage work group when we first wanted to put it together, and then we'll go from there. So after there was a lot of discussions about CSI, container storage interface, it became really clear to a handful of folks, especially chatting with folks like Chris Anichek at the CNCF and others, that there was a lot of other things we probably want to talk about around storage, whether it's bringing in other projects, whether it's creating artifacts like a storage landscape or a white paper, whether it's even just being an initial vetting mechanism for the TOC, so we can discuss and do due diligence around projects that that we might want to bring into the TOC. That could sort of be the function of the storage work group, and it was separate from CSI. CSI, we wanted to still be able to be its own independent project that could really mature and get to a place where that community felt, they were ready to bring it up for a vote in the CNCF. But the storage work group would really be separate from CSI from the perspective of there were a lot of other work streams that that the storage group could focus on. So, I think when we first kicked off the, really I would say the first project that we looked at and talked with folks about was Brook, and it was great to have Bassam come on and speak about that. And, we've also had some other folks come on and talk about OpenSDS. And that's really as far as we've got. We're really very early still, right? This is, I think, meeting 4 maybe of the work group. So that was the initial goal. That's what we wanted to do. Now, I think there was always the idea that maybe we would want to do something like write a white paper to help clarify what's happening in the cloud native storage space, or put together a landscape. I think from my conversations with Clint, who's been a great contributor to the group and really helped put a lot of pieces together, we sort of started that discussion really with the presentation that he gave to the group a couple weeks ago. And I would love to continue that, assuming that other people are keen as well. I think the goal here is really just to provide some clarification and remove ambiguity around what's happening in the storage space versus really trying to claim who's the winner in what components. So anyway, that was sort of the background. And now why don't I pause for a sec so I can answer any questions that folks generally have. And then really I'd like to transition this into just a discussion around making sure that the community does want to continue forward in that direction, as well as hear from folks about other things that they believe the work group can be focused on. So I'll pause for questions.
Just a sort of, this is Steve Watt, just a clarification, right? So from what I heard from that, we're actually a long-running work group, right? That's sort of what you're proposing.
That's exactly right.
Until at least we decide we don't want to be, or something to that effect, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, my expectation here, and Steve, I think you put this well to the TOC, is I still think there's going to continue to be some really interesting innovation in and around storage. I don't think this will just be hey, we wrote a white paper, we have a landscape, and a year from now, there's going to be nothing different. It's just going to be that.
Right. Exactly. There's a lot going on, right?
Yeah. So, so that was, again, the idea why we also wanted to make CSI and Storage Working Group deliberately separate, was that, that will remain its own project, even if it's brought into the CNCF, but there'll be other things that we can take on from a storage work group perspective. So yeah, great question, great clarification. The idea is that this would be a long-running work group.
Okay, so a bit of an orthogonal one, but I know this is, when I look at the CNCF structure, and I look at, so CNCF projects are open source, and then there's certain, projects, I would say, that are kind of being incubated by the CNCF, like CSI, that vendors are strongly incentivized to participate in, because that's kind of like a spec or a standards type thing, right? So there's like a natural incentive for proprietary vendors to participate in that versus folks working on open source projects. But I think, and I think we got some clarification on this at the TOC, but I'm like, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of incentive for proprietary vendors to stick around and participate outside of projects like the CSI, unless we have things like landscapes that reflect proprietary solutions and white papers that mention those proprietary vendors. So this is more just anecdotal, but I think it's like, there's a big, I'm just looking at the participants here, and there's this huge storage brain trust that I'm looking at. And like half of them are proprietary vendors, and we want them to stick around because they have good ideas. So I think this is something that it's just another reason why I think like the landscape and the white paper is important.
This is Gil. I agree with that. And I think, from my interaction with customers, I think what would be very valuable to them, keep putting the customers in mind first, would be that they're looking for some sort of industry endorsement on what a cloud-native storage architecture would look like. And I think it would be really valuable as an output from this working group to help clarify what is happening in the storage industry, what is inherently different about cloud-native applications, and how do cloud-native storage products fit within the CNCF landscape? So I think it's not just white papers, but I think it's around helping them understand not the day one deployment, but the day two production scenarios that they may run into, the type of things that they need to worry about, and the type of tools that I think this working group would either produce or incubate as projects or provide guidelines around how to handle day two scenarios. I think that would be very useful.
Yeah, just filling in on that. I was kind of doing a little bit of thinking from the different emails that we've seen and some of the previous discussions. And it kind of feels like there's probably 5 specific things that the working group has maybe an immediate focus for. I think based on just some of the things that we're seeing from customers that we talk to, but also just community events and that sort of thing, we certainly see a need for documents and maybe primers that kind of explain the space and explain the different technologies that are available and what they do. Because I think a lot of customers are quite bewildered when it comes to storage, primarily because we have a whole new section of customers from developers and DevOps type roles that are coming into the storage environment, which was previously probably more an operational and an infrastructure kind of role. So we're having a whole new audience come in. So an educational focus being the first one. The second thing I was thinking is clarifying the taxonomy and the landscape, which we've already talked about, but sort of making it really clear and creating some really clear groupings as to differences between API frameworks versus storage data planes versus storage orchestrators and all of these sorts of things. And then the third thing is patterns and use cases. So I think it would be exceptionally helpful if we can come up with sample patterns and sample use cases which sort of clarify where all of these different products or product groups can be used in. And then the fourth point is coming on some of the information that Steve shared in the last not in the last doc meeting, the meeting before, around orchestrated storage tools and projects and getting some listing and some definitions around that. And then finally, we probably need to discuss what we want to do around standards and specs. So, what is our involvement in, say, things like the CSI process, and do we get involved in community specs, either in terms of contributing officially or contributing unofficially, or maybe providing some stewardship or potentially direction in that space. I think those were sort of the 5 things that kind of keep on coming up multiple times.
This is John Griffith, and I'll be that guy, right? So that's a whole lot of stuff, right? But it doesn't necessarily, for me, I still have some questions about, the agenda, clarification on the roles, responsibilities, and expectations. It's still really murky and unclear to me exactly what the plan and what the objective is here, other than having other than having a committee, right? So what I'm wondering about is, for example, the interface and the proposals for the APIs. I thought that was a great direction and a great start. And moving that direction with folks like Docker and CoreOS and the Kubernetes team community and stuff like that. I think that's a great idea and that's a great way to go. But I think it needs to be very clear that that's the goal. That's the objective, as opposed to, is it just a organization for the sake of having an organization? No offense to anybody, but
I don't think that there's any offense taken. I don't think anybody wants to join yet another meeting.
Good. I didn't want it to come across the wrong way, but I've been involved in communities that are just that. So,
yeah. So these are all been great points and great discussion topics. I'm taking notes, just so you know, on little white paper, on some paper, as well as trying to transfer those notes into our running meeting minutes. And I'm writing them in blue, and if anyone looks at the doc, they'll see that I'm horribly behind, but I'm also scribbling on paper as well. So that's just a call out for anyone that wants to help write notes in the doc. By all means, jump in. I thought I would briefly moderate and address a couple of points and try to make sure that we've captured them all, and then let's keep going on the discussion. I guess starting backwards, John, no, I don't think that we want to have an organization for the sake of an organization. I think we all probably have way better things we can do with our time. I do think that there are some potential real things that we could produce, though. So let's talk about those in just a second. The point on sort of the APIs and the specs, and again, this was raised just before that by, let's see, it wasn't you, Steve.
I think it was Goo.
Was it Goo? Okay. So yeah, just before that, with respect to CSI, I want to be deliberate again that all CSI related things we really want to funnel into the CSI meetings. There's separate CSI meetings. You can be creating pull requests. You can be discussing with that community. So yes, I do think that that's an important part of storage, but I do want to be clear about the distinctions between the two. And then, and there may be future ones, that there may be future aspects of specs or APIs that does come out of this group. I think that's great, but as it stands right now, specifically the CSI, we should keep separate. So what I captured was from Goo, I'd gotten some good stuff here. On top of just thinking about a cloud native storage landscape, a cloud native storage architecture is beneficial. And really, I think the way you said it in Goo was, how storage fits into the cloud native architectures. And I think that that's sort of a more general point that was also brought up just around, of the 5 things we could be doing, one of them could be education. And some of the points around education we could be focusing on. I heard patterns and use cases of the different components of the today. So,
sorry, we're having trouble hearing you, Ben. Could the 650 number please mute?
Okay. Sorry. Are we good now?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Great. So, again, some of the actionable things I heard from here. beyond just a cloud native landscape, I heard cloud native storage architecture, how storage fits into the cloud native architecture. We can capture patterns and use cases. This again could be beyond a white paper. It could just be a collection of these things that we're trying to share with the community. Better taxonomies and glossaries, definitions of some of the different components of the stack. I'm all for it. I'm all for the working group trying to take these on and sort of producing our view of these things and our definitions. Anyway, so these are some of the things that I'm really hearing come out. And again, I'll capture as much of those as I can in the doc. But I think to answer, John, your question, this is what I think we would be working on. This would be the charter, would be to work on some of these things. So literally the outcome of the group would be that we'd have, say, a page, a doc in GitHub or something else that captures, hey, these are patterns we're seeing. These are use cases we're seeing. This is our glossary around the different components when it comes to storage in the cloud native ecosystem. Here's how we see, here's an entire collection of information around how we see how storage fits into the cloud native storage, the cloud native architecture, so forth and so on. I'll pause now.
Okay, so thanks. That definitely helps, and that clears some things up. So I think if I'm understanding correctly, the proposal is that the focus is in fact more on the white paper education type of thing, and sort of best practices, as far as storage and cloud native. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it feels like low-hanging fruit, and and again, that's why I said it's quite possible that in and amongst these discussions and this exercise, we actually say, hey, you know what? There is maybe another standard or API or other thing that we do want to figure out, and that emerges from the
So here's not to cut you off, right? So the challenge that I see with that idea in that direction, and I think it's definitely something. It'd be great. It'd be an awesome thing to work on. But the challenge that I see is, let's start with Kubernetes, for example. You've got flex volume, you've got internal cloud providers, you've got internal other storage drivers, and you've got external storage drivers and external providers. There's no cohesivity to talk about there. Look at the Rook guys in the presentation that we had with them on trying to figure out what to do with the stuff that they're working on, right? The problem is there's no, in my opinion, there's no good message to really go and talk about unless something changes in terms of how the APIs are architected and how things work, or at least a decision is made that says, hey, this is the way we do it, right? That being said, then if you throw in, Docker and DCOS by itself without running Kubernetes, or Swarm or some of these other technologies that I think are still perfectly valid and useful, then the discussion changes yet again for each one of those. And maybe I'm just, like I said, I don't want to come across as being, negative or critical or anything like that. I'm just trying to be realistic in terms of, conversations I have with people that are trying to get their head wrapped around some of this stuff. The challenges that they're having is there are too many options and everything is vastly different for them. And that's not a good experience for them at all, especially considering the pace of change these days with technologies and what they're adopting.
So, hey, John, so there's sort of two things I wanted to respond to. One is the landscape comment you made, and then I wanted to follow that on with a response. a question sort of to further what you said about process, sort of for Ben. But so I'll take the first one, which is I think what you're describing is a granularity thing. So right now, if you look at the CNCF storage landscape, it's like so vanilla, it's kind of silly, right? Like it's just like everyone and their dog that's like somewhat cloud native in there, right? And so there are some like very high level ways that we could segment them that are meaningful, right? And I think like folks are like, one is like storage adapters for cloud native platforms. Like there's a whole, you can talk about Docker volume plugins, you can talk about that whole smorgasbord of stuff. But frankly, there's like a whole lot of solutions that don't fit in there. So just calling out the fact that there are, adapters, and there's a variety of different kinds of adapters, some that are in tree, some that are out of tree. There's a spec that's being worked on. Like, I think that's useful in itself. And there's also, storage platforms that run inside Kubernetes, Mesos, Swarm, etc. Like the capability for that. That's like a separate thing. And then there's also like storage platforms that, have a service interface, right? And then those that don't. And I would, I don't want to like bring up a contentious point now, but I mean, I think like the fact that, storage platforms need a service interface to be cloud native, and so it's like, those are like three very like high level big blocks that we could immediately start sorting stuff into and talking about those patterns without having to get into the nitty gritty of should I use flex volume or should I wait for CSI, right?
Right. Okay. Yep. No, that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that. Okay.
And then the second thing on the governance. So this was also one of my questions, Ben, which is, and I sort of iterated, I've been asking questions all over the place. So I thought maybe what I could do is sort of share my understanding of it, and then you could course correct if it's inaccurate. But my understanding of the way the CNCF works is that you have a TOC, and the TOC basically vet are the sole arbiters, not the working groups. The TOC or the TOC members, which is it's a fairly small group of folks, are the sole arbiters of which projects, which open source projects get accepted into the CNCF. And you can go to the CNCF page and see like what joining the CNCF brings, but it's like CI, it's, marketing support, press support, money for docs, it's a whole lot of goodness about joining the CNCF should you choose to do so. And there's really not much sort of vested power besides the TOC in deciding what the CNCF produces and accepts. There's a governing board that sits above the TOC, but the governing board doesn't tell the TOC what to do. And so the TOC are the ones that decide what to do. And the TOC members can spin up working groups to help them with due diligence, to help inform them, etc. But essentially, like the working groups exist to inform the TOC members. And it's literally that's that simple. Is that correct, incorrect, Ben?
I think it's correct. Yeah, I think it's a good assessment. I mean, we spun up the working groups effectively exactly to help do the due diligence, to help determine what projects we may or may not want to bring in. I think that the only point that I'll make is I wouldn't underestimate the power, however, of the voice that the working groups can have coming back to the TOC. So I do think that there's that as these working groups continue to grow, I think there is a growing expectation by the TOC that if the working group has vetted something and they've done their homework and the TOC is pleased with what's been presented to them, then the future suggestions, proposals, et cetera, from the working group is going to be taken very, very seriously. So I don't want the group to feel like it's powerless because I think that would be a waste. But other than that, Steve, I think that you captured that well.
If I may add one thing, I think one of the things that I think of this working group as actually doing that would be really helpful is things that are horizontal in nature, like they span multiple vendors or they span the entire landscape, and trying to come up with either, you know, documentation, white papers, all that stuff that we talked about, Ben, but also, I mean, CSI is an example of a horizontal project. There could be others. I mean, Steve was hinting at a storage platform interface of some kind, and maybe that's a discussion point. But you know, you have a working group here full of, like I said, the brain trust around storage. Some open, some commercial. I think it'll be a really good use of people's time here if we were to work on things that are, you know, horizontally spanning in nature, can bring together all the different pieces, rather than focus on one specific vendor or one specific project. I'd say, you know, it'll be a better use of people's time to do things that are across the entire list of folks here.
Can I play the contrarian a little bit here? So I wonder if this group should be taking the lead in helping define the industry, or taking a backseat and letting the players emerge naturally and letting the market decide who the winner is, and then inducting that winner once that happens, rather than artificially trying to figure out what the best project is and letting that win.
Plus one to that, right? I think if you read through the CNCF collateral, though, they're super like trying to avoid kingmaking, but it's a difficult thing to do, especially when you're making recommendations, right? And but if Saad, you know, the way I look at the landscape thing, right? So I go back to the fact that the way like storage in the landscape right now is not super useful, and if you just simply have categories and talk about the properties of a category. So basically to fit into a category, like the categories reflect patterns. Like, so we're seeing in Cloud Native that folks are, you know, using storage adapters from their COs to talk to adjacent storage platforms. That's a pattern that exists across Docker, you know, Mesos, Cube, etc. Right? You know, and talk about the properties of the pattern, and then list, you know, some commercial vendors, some open source projects that meet that pattern, right? And that's not kingmaking. And that's very different. Landscape and white papers explaining landscapes are very different to the CNCF accepting a project to becoming a CNCF project, right? Those are two very different things. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you know, I like that idea. I also like what Alex said, which is I think this working group focusing on more horizontal projects is more useful and valuable than a specific point solution. And I think if you look at a project like Prometheus, which I consider to be horizontal, and I think it really did benefit the ecosystem, benefited the customers, benefited the community, and benefited all vendors too. And so I think focusing more along those kind of lines, and I think there's areas where this working group can contribute horizontally, like Prometheus. I mean, I don't know exactly the specifics right now, but you know, just around metrics, around storage, and those kind of things that every vendor could contribute to would benefit both the customer and all of the vendors, I think, that are in this working group. So I think, you know, again, really, I like the horizontal concept that Alex talked about. And I think, Steve, when you presented the storage orchestrators, I mentally had parsed it somewhat, you know, horizontally benefiting multiple vendors. I think thinking along those lines makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and it's like tricky. Like as we go through this, right? Like how, like, you know, it's kind of funny because it's like I look through the, you know, the participant list here, and like the average like title is CTO or like senior tech lead or something. It's like the capacity for us to spend a huge amount of time like producing stuff like this is probably quite small, and so I think we should be like super careful about how much we sign up for, and you know, so initially take small, like look for what's urgent and important, you know, that's like, as Ben said, low hanging fruit, like go tackle those things that sort of line up with what the last three people said. Right?
All right, great. So one of the open questions, Steve, that you brought up at the very beginning that, Gu responded to, and I just want to hear from others as well, is the open source versus proprietary aspect. I'll share the way that I believe that the plan is. I don't think Dan or Chris is on the line, but I believe the plan for the cloud native landscape is that there will be a future version that includes both proprietary as well as open source projects. I think the way they're doing it is they're going to get extremely high tech on us and create some sort of way of talk, like not just a graphic, but a fully interactive thing where you can turn on and off layers and you can see the proprietary ones, the open source ones. So I suppose I should really know the answer to this, but I think the official position is that from the CNCF is that incorporating things like proprietary projects is very much in scope. But I would just like to hear from others. Maybe there's aspects I'm missing. So I wanted to open that up briefly. Thanks for bringing that up at the very beginning, Steve.
I guess I would ask how that's defined. Right? So for example, if you have an appliance and it's proprietary, but all of the software and code and adapters and plugins and everything else to make it work are open source and community supported or in GitHub or whatever, how do you describe that? I'm assuming that would fall into the proprietary category, right?
There is a definition for cloud native. It's currently on the CNCF website. It says it's container packaged, dynamically managed, and microservices oriented. So I think if we use that definition, I'd say that storage projects, proprietary or open, should somehow meet that criteria to be on that in the landscape.
I guess my question is, what is it? Right? So there's multiple components to these things, and some of them may or may not be in containers.
Yeah, I mean that's an example of something that I think we as a working group could probably help in terms of definition. But I think maybe we could. I think Ben was hinting that starting at a white paper would be good,
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of that effort.
Or maybe even a white paper that asks some of these questions, right?
I mean, cloud native storage is a made up new term, so we have to define what that is at some level. I think cloud native is a made up term, but is sticking and has a little bit of more definition. So we should define what cloud native storage is.
I think we should probably define some, this probably comes into some of the things that we were talking about earlier around taxonomy, right? We can probably define some of the attributes, like, is it containerized? Is it open source or closed source? Does it have an open API? All of these sort of things as part of that classification. But John, I think you're completely right. I'd be very surprised if the things that customers are deploying don't include some mix of different components, some open, some closed, some containerized, some not. But we should probably aim to say these are the things that we think are important in cloud native storage, but also then specify why we think they're important, because they enable specific patterns or specific use cases, or they enable other things like orchestrated storage or other things or other goals that we want out of the environment.
Yeah.
Okay.
And at the last TOC, we had a TOC meeting, not this one, the one before that. There was some specific action items that came out of that in terms of defining the landscape and writing a white paper potentially as the landscape. Do we want to spend some time to talk about that?
That's a great transition. So what I've done is I've captured possible actionable next steps, the low-hanging fruit, if you will, in the doc. I've still got a lot of notes to add. Alex, I believe you're the one that had given us the 5 possible things. I think I captured 3 of them. If you wouldn't mind filling in the others in the doc, that would be very helpful. So
Sure.
what I've done though is I've told out the possible actionable next steps that it sounds like there's at least some consensus we could move forward on. And I've tried to do it in maybe a way that would be foundational for all the other things we want to do. So starting with glossary and taxonomy, then maybe moving to cloud native storage landscape and or patterns and use cases. It's a toss up. Ultimately capturing patterns and use cases. I think from that we'll be able to transition into cleanly describing how cloud native storage fits into cloud native architectures. And then finally, what is a cloud native storage architecture? I feel there'll be a lot of great discussion and debate about that one. So I figure if we can all be speaking the same language with a glossary and a taxonomy, we all know what's out there with the cloud native storage landscape. We understand from one another what are the patterns and use cases that we're seeing. We can really then start to dive into details on what a cloud native storage architecture really is. So that's the thought. This is a I think John said it best, a lot of stuff actually. So one of the things I would like to do if folks are keen to move in this direction is to talk about how we want to collaborate on this. If there are specific people that would like to take point for any of these things, and we'll make sure that we keep a big chunk of this meeting for being able to review these so that we can also ultimately publish them from the working group. So first, thoughts on the list, and second, do we have volunteers that would like to step up and help?
I think the list is great, Ben. I'd definitely be willing to volunteer. I think Steve had also in his, I think in the last presentation, had some thoughts around orchestrated, storage orchestrated solutions. And so I think maybe that could be a starting point to start defining what a cloud native storage architecture, or maybe at a high level or horizontally, would look like without specifically zooming in on one specific implementation or anything like that.
Yeah,
I think that, yeah.
I'd be happy to do that and volunteer. I thought maybe what I could do is take a stab at a particular granularity for these different categories and the properties, and then we could set up a cadence of meetings like the CSI folks have, but this is more like a landscape cadence meeting, and then we can sort of iterate and refine and improve on it there.
That sounds great.
And the output being essentially what we have here: taxonomy, landscape, patterns, and architecture. All things that are educational, horizontal in nature, and not necessarily, APIs or plugins or whatever at this point. This is just high-level definition.
I don't know if I agree about the horizontal thing, unless I'm parsing it correctly. I think there's, at a minimum, what I would like to see is a disambiguation between storage platforms that run in COs and storage platforms that are used by COs.
Right. So that's the taxonomy and definition part.
Yes.
Great. I'd be happy to participate too. I think Steve and Clinton, you guys have a good start. So we should, if nothing else, I'd say let's iterate on what you guys have and see if we can put it in, a white paper that's consumable by others.
So logistically, Ben and others, like, how do we work with Chris Anisic to like set meetings up? Like, how does that work?
That's right. So I think the question we have to ask is, we have 30 people on the call right now. How many of those 30 want to participate in this? So logistically, if 25 of them do, or 20 of them do, or whatever the number is, if it's a large number, then I think probably we focus some of the existing slots for the storage working group to actually do that. I'm not saying that if people that really want to spearhead this, a smaller group wants to jump on the side and have some quick discussions, by all means, that's great. But since I do think this is going to be an important part of the function of the group, I just want to make sure that people don't feel like they're playing musical chairs going from meeting to meeting. So what I think would be valuable is to sort of get an assessment from folks how many people want to participate in things like this. And
participate specifically to have what output?
Participate would mean to join a call like this where we literally spend the entire time just discussing the glossary and taxonomy, or just trying to put things in the landscape and lay that out. And again, we can make these meetings be more frequent, if that makes sense as well.
I think it occurs to me that some of the first steps, like the glossary, taxonomy, and the landscape stuff, is something that probably affects us all, and we probably all have a certain amount of input or opinion on it, and we probably should have 2 or 3 calls to thrash this out. I think once we get a little bit of structure after a call or two, we can probably see some natural, natural sections that might emerge where we can focus on, particular use cases or particular topics that perhaps, individuals or smaller groups might choose to focus on and have specific deliverables at that stage. But I think we probably do need a couple of whole group sessions to thrash out some of the first things. And it would probably be helpful if we met more regularly than once a month.
Thanks, Alex. Other folks have thoughts?
I don't want to dominate the discussions here, but per the TOC thread on the landscape in general, every product manager of every storage company is going to want their product ticked off in every single category. And we have to basically figure out and think about how to create a reasonable process that we don't just end up getting all these spurious requests that we're constantly having to deal with that we have no time for. And so I have some ideas around that. I don't want to be prescriptive, but it's something that we need to figure out. Otherwise, it's just going to become an endless rock fetch.
Yeah. I completely agree.
Okay,
so
I'm definitely game. I'd like to help out wherever I can, and as long as you guys want the help, I'm willing to participate.
Thanks, John. That's great. All right, so here's what I think. I think we increase the cadence at least for the next couple meetings, just so we can hammer some of this stuff out. I like Alex's suggestion of let's start with the group that can then go funnel into to I guess the polish of what we're trying to do. Steve, I hear your concern, and I think let's be really let's keep ourselves all accountable to actually making progress versus boiling the ocean. And I do think there would just be a beneficial exercise, given the nature of defining glossaries and taxonomies, to have folks together for the initial discussion. In terms of Cadence, what are we thinking here? I mean, the working groups, they've varied dramatically. You know, the networking work group for a little while was once a week. It bounces back and forth, and I expect the same thing to happen for the storage working group, depending on what we're working on. But let me just get an understanding from folks here, what they think is a good cadence for a little while. Don't be shy.
Once every 2 weeks.
Yeah, I think every other week is at least a great starting point.
And I'd highly recommend that. I mean, there are already 2 documents on this. Clint's presentation. Steve has a couple of artifacts on this. If we can try to put them all and do a bunch of offline work in Google Docs or slides or whatever, and then come to the meeting to review and discuss issues as opposed to brainstorm or just brainstorm, I think that would be a lot more efficient.
That sounds great. So every 2 weeks, I agree with you, Tom. That sounds great. Steve, Clint's unfortunately on vacation today, so he wasn't able to join the call. But Steve and Clint, let me follow up with you, and let's see how we can pull those 2 things together, so we can have a really productive meeting.
Yeah, I think Clint and I can like put like, you know, per what Bassam said, like put an initial like proposal with some content and structure around it together for the first meeting, and then we can see if everyone feels like we're on track to change. But I agree, like you know, collaborate offline, and then when we're online, like we just fine tune.
Fantastic. Okay. Great. All right. So rather than use just 9 minutes for the second part, which is cloud native storage landscape, I think instead I just want to open the floor to any other burning questions, desires, uncomfortableness, whatever it is. Let's just open that up. And if there's not a ton, I feel like we got a good thread to pull on, a good trajectory to go down, and we can even just end early.
I just want to kind of clarify. So this might be a good time for me to stop working on my CSI interface implementation.
Why do you say that?
Well, so it sounds like, well, okay, so then I'm glad I asked.
Me too. Yeah, go ahead, John. Could clarify that.
Well, so I guess I'm still a little, I guess maybe I'm still a little confused on the charter in terms of what we're going to prioritize and work on and stuff like that. Because towards the end of the meeting here, my impression was that the focus and the effort would be more focused on you know, the defining cloud native storage and patterns and definitions, et cetera, blogs, white papers, so on and so forth, as opposed to hammering on API standards and interfaces and things like that, and letting that more, and somebody actually said to the point, I think it was Stephen, of rather than trying to guide that answer in that direction, let it kind of become a de facto thing, right? So, you know, I apologize, maybe, especially at the very end of the meeting. For
No.
That was sod for the record.
Okay. Yeah, and this is precisely why I asked the question. So again, as far as the storage working group perspective is concerned, and as far as I have authority to say this, which I really don't, the storage working groups supports the CSI project and the work that they're doing, and we're very eager and looking forward to CSI being brought into CNCF as an official project. But as an independent project, while I think it will make sense for the storage working group to continue to have the CSI project be presenting back to the group and discussing what they're doing, and for us all to stay abreast, storage working group is not the governing charter of CSI. So I'm, what we're trying to focus on right now in the storage working group is these other things, this low-hanging fruit. But CSI is very, very, very much from the perspective of the storage working group and the CSI, the direction that we're interested in seeing folks take. So if John, if you want to have more involvement in CSI, please join those meetings. Please participate in that community. I think we're really looking forward to having you be part of both, because ultimately cloud native storage is going to be some CSI and some other stuff as well.
I think I've just discovered why I'm so confused. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, just to second that, right? Like the CSI is part of the, if you look at the landscape category, right? And I talked about adaptive frameworks for COs, right? Like the CSI fits perfectly into that category. But like what we've been talking about here is there are other categories, right? And so we just want to expand our scope and articulate the rest of the stuff as well, but like definitely keep going on CSI.
Let me just add a few words here, because I typed some things on the chat. And so I just want to expand on that, because I'm confused too. I think before we start going forward on directions, we need to first define what the team or what the community or this forum is supposed to accomplish and output. I think that will help a lot. I think once we have FADAF as a foundation, then we can stand on that and continue forward. But we are still, and I myself, and it looks like John also, are still confused on what is the output and success of this community, right?
Thanks, Louis. So I've just added to the actual next steps. Let me capture what we've captured in the discussion here today in text as really, the storage working group's charter. I'll take that one. I'll put that together. I'll put it up in a doc, put it on the website probably. We can review that and make sure that based on everything we talked about today, that folks agree with that. It's an important step. You're right. We talked about it today. I think there was more consensus around what the group can focus on, but it would be even better to get that written up so that people can read it and make sure they fully understand it.
My takeaway was that the product that this group will produce is education of two distinct sets of groups. One is the TOC for CNCF, who is responsible for inducting new projects into CNCF. And the second is just educating the general public who's curious about what it means to what cloud native storage means. The way that Steve broke it down into these three big areas kind of makes sense to me.
That makes sense to me, Saad.
And to that end, we also have the CSI meeting starting in 2 minutes. If you guys are interested, jump on that.
Nice, Saad. Nice.
And by the way, there's my confusion. So I didn't realize that the storage working group and the CSI were two distinct.
Got it. Okay. Thanks, John. Good. All right. Awesome. Let's call it. Folks, have any more questions, please reach out to me. Thank you for everyone's participation. Steve and Clint, who's not on the call, I'll follow up with you about driving that for the next meeting, and we'll update it to every 2 weeks. Thanks, folks.
I'm going to paste a link to the CSI meeting in the chat for those who are interested. Stay online.
That's great, Saad. Thank you. All right, folks. See you in 2 weeks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Hello?